Okay, good afternoon. My name is Richard Kaplan. I'm Professor of International Relations at the University of Oxford. I'll be lecturing today on the United Nations and international security. For purposes of this lecture, I'm going to be referring to the UN Charter. Charters and constitutions are the very foundations of organizations, whether it's the European Union, ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian States, the African Union, or FIFA, the International Football Association for that matter. Charters and constitutions tell us a lot about the basic principles of an organization and how that organization works or should work, and the UN Charter is no exception in this regard. Of course, practice doesn't always conform to theory, and here too the UN's no exception, but nevertheless the UN is a useful starting point for gaining an appreciation of the role of the organization in the arena of international security, and I would encourage you to take a look at it. I'll be showing you excerpts from the Charter in my lecture today. But before we turn to this Charter, let me start with a few basic facts about the UN. First of all, the UN is an organization made up of member states, 193 member states to be precise. Nearly every state in the world is a member of the United Nations. The near universality of the UN arguably gives it greater legitimacy than its predecessor organization, the League of Nations, had. The United States was not a member of the League, nor was the Soviet Union initially, and their absence from the League, it could be argued, hampered its effectiveness. Now, although virtually all states in the world are members of the UN is not a world government. The UN is what we call an intergovernmental organization, which is to say that sovereign authority remains, for the most part, with the member states. That means the UN can only do what its members allow it to do. And this is important because when the UN fails to take effective action, as it failed to do with respect to the humanitarian atrocities being committed in Bosnia and Herzegovina or Rwanda in the 1990s, it's not the UN itself that bears responsibility, but rather the UN's member states. Now, that doesn't mean that the UN as an organization has no autonomous powers. The Secretary General has some, as we'll see later, but the autonomy of the UN tends to be exaggerated. Now, another point to bear in mind is that the UN is not just the Security Council or the General Assembly or the Secretariat. These are three principal organs of the UN, to be sure, but the UN is a family of bodies that also includes the International Court of Justice, also known as the World Court, ECOSOC, the Economic and Social Council, the International Labour Organization, UNESCO, and the World Health Organization, among many others. For purposes of this lecture, I'm going to be concentrating on the Security Council, but you mustn't think that that's all there is to the UN. Now, what's the purpose of the UN? Here it's useful to turn to the Charter. Article 1.1 tells us that one of the purposes of the UN, and I would argue the primary purpose, is to maintain international peace and security. It also says that towards that end, member states will take effective collective measures for the prevention and removal of threats to the peace and for the suppression of acts of aggression or other breaches of the peace. Now, it's the bit about collective measures that I want to focus on for a moment. The UN is a collective security organization. What exactly does that mean? The idea behind collective security is that all members of the organization agree to join forces to protect any one of its members from the unlawful use of force by any one or several states. Now, I'll come back to the distinction between lawful and unlawful use of force a little bit later.